Ever wonder why we call the mass avoidance of some business boycotting? Well, I hope so, because that's what we're going to talk about today. The term boycotting was named after the 19th century Englishman, Captain Charles C. Boycott, who originally had the surname Boycat, but the family changed the spelling when he was 9 years old. If you guessed that at a certain point Captain Boycott became quite unpopular with the masses, you get a gold star. Shortly before Boycott would find himself boycotted, the situation in Ireland was that just 0.2% of the population owned almost every square inch of the land in Ireland. Most of the owners of the land also didn't live in Ireland, but simply rented their land out to tenant farmers, generally on one-year leases. As you can imagine, this caused some issues with the populace, and in the mid-19th century, many of these tenant farmers banded together with three goals: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. One particular organization that emerged in the 1870s pushing these three F's, among other things, was the Irish National Land League. This brings us to September of 1880. The leader of the Land League, Parliament member Charles Stewart Parnell, was giving a speech to many of the members of that organization. During the speech, after the crowd, in true mob-like fashion, expressed that any tenant farmer who bids on an evicted neighbor's land should be killed, Parnell humbly suggested that another tax should be used. Rather than murder the individual, he proposed it would be more Christian to simply, to quote, shun him on the fair green and in the marketplace, and even in the place of worship, by leaving him alone, by putting him in moral coventry, by isolating him from the rest of the country as if he were a leper of old. You must show him your detestation of the crime he committed. Essentially, they were to be boycotted, but they didn't have that term yet, though they wouldn't have to wait long. The first documented reference of boycott being used as a verb was just 2 weeks after that speech. At the time, Captain Charles Boycott, now retired from the military, was working as a land manager for the 3rd Earl of Erne, John Crichton. The harvest that year wasn't turning out well for many farmers, so as a concession to tenants, Boycott decided to reduce their rent by 10%. Rather than accept this, however, his tenants demanded a 25% reduction, which Boycott's boss, the Earl of Erne, refused. In the end, 11 of the Earl's tenants didn't pay their rent. Thus, a mere 3 days after this speech, Boycott began the process of serving eviction notices to those who hadn't paid, sending out the fuzz to do this. Needless to say, this did not go over well with the already riled up masses. Upon the tenants realizing eviction notices were going out, the women of the area began throwing things such as rocks and manure at those delivering the notices, until the fuzz left without being able to serve all the notices to the head of the households, which was required by the law for the eviction notice to be considered served. Without the notices delivered, nobody had to leave their homes. Next, the teeming masses decided to use Parnell's proposed social ostracism against Boycott and anyone who worked under him. Soon, those who worked under Boycott began leaving his service, often with those workers being coerced and threatened by others until they, too, joined in the ostracizing of Boycott. This ultimately left Boycott with a large estate to manage, but no workers to farm the remainder of the crops. Other businesses also stopped being willing to do business with Boycott. He couldn't even buy food locally, and getting it from afar was difficult, as carriage drivers, ship captains, and letter handlers on the whole would not work with him. In late November, this led to Boycott being forced to leave his home, fleeing to Dublin. Even there, he was met with hostility, and businesses that were willing to serve him were threatened with being boycotted. The practice of boycotting spread from here, and within a decade, whenever a business did something to the dislike of the Irish National League, the business would quickly find themselves boycotted, with the name for the practice sticking due to the wide publication of Boycott's plight in the news. By 1888, just 8 years after Boycott was first boycotted, the word even made it into the New English Dictionary on Historical Principles, better known today as the Oxford English Dictionary. The word spread to other European languages and quickly made it over to America when Captain Boycott visited friends in Virginia, attempting to do so in secret, registering under the name Charles Cunningham. The newspapers caught wind of his arrival anyway and widely publicized his history, which got the term firmly planted in American English as well. And going back to Boycott's crops, he did get them harvested the year he was boycotted, finding 50 workers from out of town to come harvest the crops. Problem was that the locals did not take kindly to this, so the government had to step in and had nearly 1,000 soldiers escort the workers and protect them while they worked. Funny enough, this ended up costing the British government about £10,000. So how much were the crops worth? About 500. Now how about a bonus fact? Boycotting out of the way, let's now discuss blackmail and its forgotten, more humorous cousin, buttock-mail. Blackmail has its roots in the early 16th century, first used by English farmers living on the England-Scotland border. It derives from the Middle English word mail, which itself is thought to derive from the Old English word mal, meaning lawsuit, terms, bargaining agreement. Over time, the word mal became mail, which in Middle English roughly translated to either rent or tribute. As such, the rent paid by a farmer living on the Scottish border was known as silver rent or silver mail because it was normally paid in silver. This gave rise to white money or white rent and eventually white mail. Now, when Scottish chieftains and various brigands noticed all these well-to-do farmers going about their business without someone threatening them for money, they decided to start threatening them for money, in return for not razing their farm to the ground and destroying all their livestock. Those forcing the tribute would also then offer their protection to the farmers from others who might try something similar. Farmers almost immediately began referring to this secondary rent that they were being forced to pay as black rent, which if you've been paying attention was then called blackmail. Etymologists aren't sure where the black part of the blackmail came from. Seemingly, the most obvious answer is that it's simply due to the connotations black had with evil and the contrast between white mail. But the most obvious answer and the correct one aren't necessarily the same, and lacking direct evidence, many other theories have popped up. The most probable of the bunch is by Charles Mackay in the Dictionary of Lowland Scots, 1888, who claimed it derives from the Gaelic black, meaning to protect, so protection rent. Somewhat less plausible theories include that it was because a farmer's raided livestock would be sold off on the black market, that if it wasn't paid, your farm would be raided at night by individuals dressed in black, or that it was purely because all the Scottish raiders demanded their payment in black cows. Needless to say, we can probably safely discard the latter three proposed theories. Whatever the case, in 1814, the Scottish playwright Sir Walter Scott gave the world perhaps the most detailed explanation of what blackmail back in those days entailed. In Scott's historical novel, Waverley, blackmail is described as follows: a sort of protection money that low country gentlemen and inheritors lying near the Highlands pay to some Highland chief that he may neither do them harm himself, nor suffer it to be done to them by others. Scott also mentions that if a person paying this protection money comes to harm or suffers a loss at the hands of another raider, the person they were paying would endeavor to cover their losses, usually by stealing replacements from someone who wasn't paying them protection money. Whether this led to a hilarious situation in which two warring Scottish chiefs ended up continually stealing and then replacing a farmer's sheep isn't known, but in the interest of making history more fascinating than it already generally is, we're going to assume it did. We're likewise going to assume that while it was happening, the farmers played the Benny Hill theme. The fact that the song wasn't composed until the 1960s and the saxophone not invented until the 1840s is neither here nor there. Work with me here. This all brings us to yet another form of mail that was popular from about the 16th century through the 19th century that, purely for its amusing sounding nature, we'd like to bring back into common usage in some form or other: buttock-mail. Given what you now know of mail, if you guessed that buttock-mail was some form of payment in order to keep things quiet about your having a good time with someone's buttock, you actually wouldn't be that far off. In fact, in Scotland, buttock-mail was a sort of tax introduced in 1595, which was enforced by the church courts. Essentially, if you had sex outside of wedlock, often with a prostitute, hence the buttock part, which was a slang for prostitute, and you were a Presbyterian in Scotland, you could often be given the choice of the stool of repentance or paying buttock-mail to stop from having to stand on a stool in front of everyone and get berated by your local minister for your lustful actions. Now, while the latter, standing on a punishment stool while an authority figure insults you, may seem quite enjoyable as a warm-up to sex outside of wedlock, it turns out many prefer to avoid this for some weird reason. In fact, there are known cases of individuals having taken their own life rather than have to face the stool of repentance and the fornicator label that would be following them the rest of their lives. Thus, if one could afford it, the hefty buttock-mail tax was generally preferred. Now, before everybody leaves, just wanted to say thank you to our YouTube members and patrons over on Patreon, like our extremely long-time supporter, the Professor Mark Baffardi. If you'd like to join us in helping to make these educational videos, please do check out our new YouTube membership option or Patreon page and the perks we offer in the links below. If you're not able, no worries. As ever, thank you for watching and helping us keep this channel going that way. And a special gold star for you for watching to the end. It's amazing how much that helps with the YouTube gods.